Hi everyone, we're about to close 2022 and today is the time to go back on 1 year of ownership of the Ioniq EV 28 kilowatt hours. In this video, I'm going to give you all the stats, all the numbers that tell you more about efficiency, consumption, costs, and all the rest. So bear with me and let me know if that's of help to you. Let's get straight in. So first thing, we got the car in December 2021, so just above 12 months ago. And since then, we have actually reported all the daily trips that we've done. That's quite easy because the car does that for you. And then from there onwards, it's easy to make a note of the distance and then the consumption on miles per kilowatt hours. And then you can convert that also into kilometers and watt hours per kilometer. So let's take a first look at those stats. It tells us we've done something like more than 11,000 miles. That's 18,000 kilometers. That's what we've recorded on the odometer. Now we've done 4.7 miles per kilowatt hours, which is very decent, 133 watt hours per kilometer. What's interesting in here is, first of all, that's indeed a very good consumption. I think it would be very hard to find any other electric car that consumes this kind of amount. We've done, as you can see here, quite a lot of longer trips, 8 trips that were 250 miles or above in a day, for an average of 148 watt hours per kilometer, which again is very, very decent because then you are driving on the motorways. Sub 250 miles, interestingly, this is just as low as the overall average at 133. So there have been days with 100 miles, 200 miles and the likes, and we were spot on the average. So that means if you're going to be cruising on the normal roads, for instance, that's going to be very efficient. And then conversely, if you're going to do a local commute in winter, for instance, that's actually a little bit higher, 156 watt hours per kilometers, or nearly 4 miles per kilowatt hours. You can see 200 trips, 200 days really, where that would be the case. Now, sometimes you can get 2 trips during the day if the car has been stopped for more than a few hours, right? So that gives us a few stats. Importantly, the car doesn't consume much, we knew that, but importantly as well, the range, the miles per kilowatt hour, it's going to be typically around that 4.5 mark. There are not going to be that many scenarios where you would expect something completely outrageous, and that is thanks to the heat pump in particular, because that heat pump is going to help you during the summer and during the winter to try and not consume too much energy just heating up the cabin. And again, in between 10 miles and 500 miles traveled, you can see your average is contained between 4 miles per kilowatt hours and 6 miles per kilowatt hours. Now, the other way to look at this is to do a histogram of the distribution. So what is this? That means it's the number of instances, the number of cases where the consumption was between 4 and 4.5 or 4.5 and 5 and so on and so forth. That is much more helpful, as a matter of fact, because it tells you again that the most likely outcome is that you're going to be somewhere between 4.5 and 6 miles per kilowatt hours. And that is equivalent to somewhere between 100 and 140 watt hours per kilometer. So the vast majority of your travel is going to be done within those boundaries. And again, this is number of trips, so you need to pay attention to that. This is not the number of kilometers. Now, the number of kilometers might be closer to the 140 to 160 because, of course, this would be the motorway type travel. So it's going to be a little bit more consumption then. Okay, and then final thing on this history here is that you can take a look at the watt hours per kilometers as a function of the distance traveled, and you can see, yeah, it's going up if you have more kilometers traveled, but not by much. So any trip between 100 and 500 is going to be much more down to the conditions of the roads you're using. And then finally, as a function of speed, now you will see, and I can put the video up here, but you will see there's another video where we are getting much more granular. We are downloading all the data about the car, and we get a lot more granular about the influence of speed on watt hours per kilometer. So I invite you to take a look at that one instead. But this is on the basis of trips that are more than 10 kilometers, a number of those. You can see how the speed, the average speed of the travel influences the consumption. And the answer is, well, it depends, because again, those trips, the average speed on the trip might have been a combination of a number of different things. And that's why you don't see that much variance. And again, the usual kind of 130 to 160 being a quite classic outcome. Now, if you were to go beyond 100 kilometers an hour, that would be a different ball game. You'd be closer to 200. So my experience is that if you want to do a proper GPS or sat nav 130 kilometers per hour, you're looking at 200 watt hours per kilometer with some heating or some cooling in the car. And then if you are doing more like 110 kilometers an hour, then you're maybe more at 150, 55, 60 maybe. And then if you're on an A road or on a B road at 60 kilometers an hour, this is super efficient. You're going to be looking at 110, 120 watt hours per kilometer, maybe, especially if the weather is good. So that's it. That's part one done. That's the look at the history of the consumption as per what the car says, right? So this is just telling what the car is reporting. All right. So part two now, this is about looking at how much we've charged the vehicle, for how much, what was the price per kilowatt hours, therefore the total cost of each and every charge, and then whether we used AC or DC, whether it was public free, public paid. And we've actually made a note of all those charging stops across those various months, and you can see there's quite a few of them. What does the summary of all those charging sessions tell us? Number one, the actual kilometers traveled is 18,906 for miles traveled, 11.7k. All right, so that's quite a lot. Actually, it's typically more than we would have done, but then again, instead of taking the plane, for instance, we ended up using the car. So I think all in all, it's quite a lot of a distance, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are worse where it comes to use of energy. We spent £483 in total. Now, of course, some of this will have been in euros because we've traveled to France and Switzerland. We therefore have spent on average 16 pence per kilowatt hours. Is that a lot? Well, that's comparable to the kind of tariff that we would have had or last summer 2021. We were paying about 15, 16 pence per kilowatt hours for energy in the home, electricity in the home. So that's very comparable. Now, of course, this is a blend of a whole variety of things, and I'll come back to that in a second. I think it's pretty decent, in fact, but like I said, it's made up of all the way from free to quite expensive, and therefore 16 pence is actually quite decent. Very importantly, the real efficiency, so the wall-to-wall energy charged on the car is 4 miles per kilowatt hours or 155 watt hours per kilometer. Now, again, that's very good, and that's very consistent with what we've seen in part one, which was the display from the car. What that tells us is that 85.7% of the energy that we've drawn from the grid has been used to be discharged by the car and therefore converted into motion, if you will. The cost per kilometer is therefore 2.5 pence per kilometer, which compared to our previous diesel, which was doing 5.7 liters. So that's about a 4-to-1 ratio in favor of the electric car. And you can see it here, the fuel savings would be £1,400 compared to a spend of £1,890 for diesel. So quite a drastic difference, £1,400. Now, one thing to note is we do have one subscription, the Ionity subscription, as well as we did put in those numbers, the cards we bought, and therefore that means that the ratio is in fact not 4:1 but 3:1. So the EV is 3 times cheaper per kilometer than the diesel car. In fact, you could look at it in a different way. You could say that the EV is equivalent to 1.8 liters per 100 kilometer in price. So if I bought a car and I wanted to use the traditional way of counting how much it cost me, well, it's a car that cost me 1.8 liters per 100 kilometers. That's really what it is. In terms of energy consumption, this is even more impressive because it's actually 1.5 liters per 100 kilometer in terms of energy. In terms of CO2 saved, you could argue we've saved up to 2.8 tons of CO2. Now that's if each and every piece of charging that we've done was backed up by renewables, which may or may not be true. I mean, we are supposed to be backed up by renewables at home, and a number of the chargers will say that they are, but who knows, right? So up to 2.8 tons of CO2. More importantly to me, this is a much more efficient car than a diesel car or petrol car. You won't find a car that can run on 1.5 liters per 100 kilometer in terms of energy equivalent, right? So if anything, it has to be a better way to drive in electric, even if it was backed up by, polluting energy, which in theory it's not. So what is the break-even for the car versus our diesel car? It would be 59 pence per kilowatt hour. So that's at the latest prices on diesel. If we were to pay 59 and we pay 16, that would be the break-even. You could split it into something like 23 pence per kilowatt hours at home. And you will see in a second, it's about 7 for us at home. And then DC, so you would be willing to spend up to £1, a little bit more than £1 per kilowatt hours when you are taking the motorway and driving, away from home. So that's the overall picture. Clearly a very good picture in terms of efficiency of the car, in terms of cost, the running cost of the fuel, and then in terms of, how far the electricity prices could go up to make sure that we are not ending up paying even more than a diesel car. But now let's take a look at a second picture, which is the picture of charging, looking at all the charges and everything. Well, the first thing is we've made a note when we charged how much we've charged in percentage every time we went up to 100%. And if I look at the lower percentile, it tells me that the equivalent would be 29.1 kilowatt hours wall to wall of energy. And given my 87% efficiency, I'm saying that it's kind of like having a maximum usable 24.9 kilowatt hours in the battery. So I've got 24.9 that I can discharge from the car. Now that number is very similar to the other estimates I've had. So that's quite interesting to see a bit of triangulation there, because it's very similar to other numbers I've had before, 24.5, close to 25. In terms of the next bit, how much have we charged in AC? Well, 53 charges, DC 59 charges, so nearly 50-50. We got it right the first time around. In other words, we didn't have to fiddle around or we didn't have any problems. We just tap the card or use the app, and it worked in 83% of the cases in AC and 67% in DC. 75%, so that's 3 out of 4. In my mind, that's just not good enough, right? Let's be honest, let's call it as it is. A system that works first time right, 3 out of 4 times, that's not quite good, right? That's okay. I think very importantly, pretty much every time we've managed to get a charge out of those stations, but 75% to get it to work immediately, yeah, not fantastic, not fantastic. In terms of how much we've charged, right? So not the number of times, but this time the amount we've charged. We've charged 2/3 in AC and 1/3 in DC, which is quite classic. We'll come back to this in a second, but you would expect to charge a lot in AC. It's supposed to be a bit better for the car. And yes, it is slower, but that's also what you get at home. When we charged in AC, we spent £172. So that's about 9p per kilowatt hours. We did that 176 times. And that means we charged every 72 kilometers. That's not a lot. I have to admit that. A third of our charges are in DC, and that means nearly 1 megawatt hours. We spent £300. That's before the subscriptions, by the way. And that's about 32 pence per kilowatt hours. We charge 64 times in DC. That's about charging every 100 kilometers. Again, not huge, but we knew that when we got the car. It's a car that has a fast charging but on a small battery, and therefore you end up charging it quite often. Well, it's okay as long as it charges fast and it doesn't get in the way. And I think that's the conclusion for how we've used the car so far. Now, if I look at the distribution, the mix of types of charging, so 44% at home and 5% home from home. So that's kind of you're on a holiday or you're away, but you can still charge from your new home. So that's about half. It's probably quite low, in fact, compared to what maybe most EV drivers would do. Partly because of the smaller battery, partly because really we've got a car also to go at and do things for long range distances. It's been car, there's been no flights. 11% public free. This is probably a category that's dying. I think there are fewer and fewer places where it's going to be free, and for good reason. I think that's absolutely fair. And then public paid, 39%. So all of that adds up to our £483, and that means 16 pence per kilowatt hours on this particular summary. Okay, and 240 charges. So that means we're charging almost every other day. In fact, a little bit more than that. If we look at all the providers now, that's quite interesting. That gives us which providers we've used. Now you can see a little color scheme going on here. In purple, we've used Ionity both in France and the UK. In orange, these are the UK only chargers, or typically they are focused on UK charging points. In blue, this is either because they are focused on France, or they have been mostly used by us in France. For instance, Tesla, and clearly is not just available in France. And then this one is actually Switzerland. So that's what the colors mean here. You can see that 40% of our public charges are with Ionity, so that's quite big. 572 kilowatt hours, we spend £150 at just 26 pence. At the minute, it's really good going, right? So we charge 37 times, that's a lot. It's only been okay 75%, 76% of the time. I'm a bit disappointed by this fact. And these can be really minor glitches. For instance, you tap the card and it doesn't work, and therefore you have to play with the app. That's fine, it charges still, but these are the kind of glitches that I wasn't quite expecting when I took Ionity, which I consider to be a bit of a premium brand. Now, having said that, we've always charged and it's always worked. And I think there's been twice where we had to wait. Yeah, so 2 times out of 37 times we had to wait, and once, and again, you can check out the videos for that. But in one case, it was a very long wait. But other than that, 37, and we are away always during those big vacation times, midterms, and those big vacation holidays when everyone's on the road. So that, I think that's very good going. We've saved about £45 for using the subscription on my Hyundai, which means the real price is actually 50 pence per kilowatt hours, right? It's not quite as good now, but still, again, need to remember what's important is the blend of all the expensive energy with the not so expensive energy. So a lot of time spent on Ionity there, but what about the rest? Well, without much surprise. We've used Podpoint because they are prevalent in the UK, and BP Pulse. They didn't cost us much because they still had quite a lot of free charging. Again, not sure that's going to be the case in 2023. GridServe. So GridServe was okay. It's getting quite expensive as well. And then you get this myriad of smaller chargers, a lot from the departments in France themselves. So that's what those things mean. They are individual departments of France. And this one here is in Paris. You get this specific network from Paris. And I think it belongs to Total as well. Now, interestingly, Total comes out as one of those big brands. You know, you've got BP, Total, and Shell, those big petrol brands, and they're making an effort, and you can see I'm using them as well, but they come out to be quite expensive. Yeah, and Tesla is super expensive as well. I actually try to avoid Tesla because, number one, for the Ioniq, on the latest chargers, it doesn't feel perfectly. It works, but you have to push a little bit more than I'd care for. And then second thing, they are very expensive at the minute anyway, right? So that gives us the overall picture in terms of how you end up using one main provider, but then a very long tail of all those different networks. And I'll probably do a separate video about the different cards I'm using, the different apps. Let me know if that's of interest to you. Let me know in the comments maybe which networks you're using if you're traveling in the UK and maybe in France as well. But also tell me if you're interested in a video that tells you a little bit more about those different apps and different charging cards that you may have. 122 chargers. Well, that's a lot of charging. There's no question about that. That's kind of what we signed up for the car, and I think it's working well overall. I think that's the summary for this section, which is it's a car that's cheap to run, it is very efficient, and yes, it works with obviously all the charging networks. We wished there were a few more charging stations on the motorways, but this is changing quite rapidly. I think we've seen on our last trip there are some really good charging stations being put in place, and not, you know, your ones and your twos, but more like 16 connectors in one place. I think that's going to be a massive difference come the summer, and already it's good enough for us with the small battery car. So I think we're looking good. Right, final part now is to take a look at the overall set of costs. That's always a little bit more tricky. I try to categorize the various costs. The first one is actually that insurance is an expensive thing, 539. Let's remember though, we're going abroad, so we've got additional cover. In terms of energy, we've covered that already, so that was £480 or thereabouts. Hardware was an interesting one, so we had to spend a bit of money on tires. There was one tire to change. We had a bit of an issue with a window that had to be repaired. Then I've counted, and you could argue this shouldn't really be there, but I've counted the depreciation of the Saint-Kivi home charger on the 2-year depreciation schedule, which is very quick. But I thought that, you know, to be fair, if we're going to compare to a car that doesn't need a charger, well, this one does. So why don't I actually count some form of depreciation? Like I said, we've got the card subscriptions, so £120 odd there, and then an MOT, £40. The service was actually free on this occasion, and that's it. There is no tax. That's it, right? So overall, £1,760. We could talk about depreciation, but it's been a very, very funny year, so I'm not sure we want to count that. Is it almost too much? Is it too little? Very hard to tell, frankly. So not a really good year for that. But having driven the best part of 19,000 kilometers, including depreciation, it's about £300. But again, I'm not sure this number is worth very much. So it's very early to compare. I think if we want to take a look at depreciation versus a normal car, we'll have to wait a bit longer for that. But equivalent cost per month, if you are just looking at the running costs, it's 141 and just £38 per month of fuel, right? That's 660 miles per month. that have been driven, and therefore the overall cost, excluding car depreciation, is about 9 pence per kilometer. So that's it. That's the full picture. I'm not sure whether there's very much to make of that particular picture. I've done previously another video where I was comparing some of the costs, so you may want to check that as well. But let me know if there are questions on this particular topic. I think this is quite low on the ongoing charges, although there have been a few unexpected things like having to change a tire or a window, and I'm also loading it with the charger depreciation. But again, let me know if you have any comments. Right, so I think that's all I wanted to show today. Let me know if that makes sense. Let me know if you have any comments. And it's been a long video. I hope that you found it interesting, and I thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.